Welcome to part 2 of lecture 5, The Roots of AI. I want to very briefly go over the history of the development of AI, and at the end of this lecture, I'm going to come back to the question of the mind-body problem and how that frames the conversation about artificial intelligence. In all likelihood, next week, in lecture 6, we'll go more completely and more deeply into some of these issues. Ramon Lull developed several logical machines devoted to the production of knowledge by logical means. He described his machines as mechanical entities that could combine basic and undeniable truths by simple logical operations produced by the machine by mechanical means in such a way as to produce all the possible knowledge. Lull's work had a great influence on Leibniz, who would further develop his ideas. As you're looking at this, I want to stress the concept of knowledge as production by logical means, that the brain implicitly is a mechanical entity that could combine basic and undeniable truths by simple logical operations. The implications of Lull's argument is that the brain is little more than a machine. This will become quite telling over the next 300 years, but it will also, in some respects, be radically changed by Descartes. Leibniz was working after Descartes, and Descartes definitely had an influence on Leibniz. He speculated that human reason can be reduced to mechanical calculations. He envisioned a universal language, which of course would be based upon mathematics and logic, which would reduce all information, all human thought to a series of calculations. There would be no need for disputation or disagreement, because in the end, there would be a universal language based on mathematical calculation. In the 19th century, Frege will do some interesting and fascinating work on isolating genuine logical principles of inference so that the proper representation of a mathematical proof would not involve, key phrase, would not involve intuition. And if it did, then the intuitive element would need to be isolated and represented as an axiom. And by axiom, he meant a hypothesis. As a given starting point. In the 20th century, Frege's work will become the foundation for Bool's work, from whom we get Boolean logic. That would be picked up by Bertrand Russell, Alfred Lord North Whitehead in Principia Mathematica in 1913, which becomes one of the most important books of the early part of the 20th century. David Hilbert will pick up many of the ideas, but also challenge them. And his question will be quite telling. And that resulted in Gödel's incompleteness theorem, which essentially says that no logical system is complete in and of itself. Next week, we're going to talk more about Turing and Church and lambda calculus. But let's go back in time. We've alluded to this before. One of the turning points in Western culture is represented by Augustine of Hippo. Augustine was born in North Africa. And to put it mildly, he had a colorful youth. And by the time he was a teenager, he was the consummate party boy of his day. At one point, he had a 10-year relationship with a woman to whom he was not married, had a child, and at the insistence of his mother, Augustine walked away from that relationship. He subsequently married a 12-year-old girl from a prominent family. We don't know much about that relationship. The assumption seems to be that it was a marriage in name only. Eventually, in part to flee his overbearing mother, Augustine left for Rome. And when he got to Rome, he met Ambrose, who was then a prominent Christian theologian, and Augustine converted. However, before he converted under the tutelage of Ambrose, Augustine was a Manichaean. The Manichaeans claimed as the founder of their religion Mani. It was a rigidly dualistic system. And that dualism had as its roots a form of Gnosticism. Gnosticism comes from the Greek gnosis, to know. Most of the details of the Manichaean system are beyond what we will deal with here in this class. You are free to ask about them next week. What it comes down to is that there was a creator God, and for reasons which are not clear, there are 9 demigods who are created by the creator God, each one less perfect. The last one rebels and creates the physical world, including humans. In that creative action, the fall becomes part of history. But the implication is clearly that humans, by the nature of their creation, are distinctive in that they are soul and body. The body is our link to the material world. The soul will be our link back to God. There is a clear identification between the soul and the mind. So very early in Christianity, we distinguish between the mind and the body, which in Descartes becomes the mind-body problem. If you think about Genesis and the creation of humans in Genesis, then according to the story, part of Ha-Adam By the way, in Hebrew, it isn't Adam, it's the human until Eve is created, is dust or dirt, depending on how you translate the Hebrew, which the gods outline, but it has no life until the gods breathe into it. The breath, which is the life force, links back to the gods. By the way, the word in Hebrew is Elohim, which is the plural of El, which means God. The Hebrews, we mentioned before, were henotheists, not monotheists. A henotheist believes that there are many gods, but only one for him or her. Augustine's Manichaean theology fits really well with this myth. And from that point on, Christianity will distinguish between the soul and the body. In all circumstances, all the way down to Rene Descartes, human intellect, the human mind, logic and reason are a function of the soul. Everything else, including emotion, and by implication, intuition, are imperfect forms that are derived from the body. This becomes Descartes' argument. When people like Lull and Frege and Leibniz begin the quest for machines that can think, or to reduce all of human logic, all of human language, all of human knowledge down to a machine, this is the motivation for doing it. I'll remind you that one of the fundamental theses in this class is that this model is flawed, deeply flawed, that humans engage the world emotionally first. Number two, we contend that the mind independently of the body does not exist. The phrase that's used today is all mental states are brain states. Which means ultimately that consciousness, logic, reason, it's all part of the biological organ called the human brain. Much more to say on this topic. Hopefully we'll pick up on it next week in lecture for week 6. In the meantime, if you have any questions about any of the material covered in this lecture, please remember you can always email me or come to office hours.